We're going to be finishing up our lesson in Psalms 139. So let's do a quick recap of what we talked about at the beginning. We're in the second half of that chapter. We're going to talk about the very beginning of that. We see that first couple verses there. O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me. Thou knowest my down sitting and my uprising. Thou understandest my thoughts afar off. We see in Psalms 139, this is a Psalm of David, as we remember we looked at last time. This is we believe it's written around the time after David's kingdom was established, and God has made his covenant with him that he would build the temple and out of David's lineage, and that David helped start that process in motion, and that God would establish his lineage. And so David is in awe of who God is and what God has done. Remember, we thought about who David is, or who he was. He was a shepherd boy, now king. And David's reflecting back on his life and what God has done through his life, and all those the ways that God knew everything about him, knew his strengths and his weaknesses. In the first part of that, verses 1 through 6, we looked at his omniscience, that God knows that truth that he says there at the very beginning. Thou knowest my down sitting and my uprising. Thou understandest my thoughts afar off. Thou compassest my path and my lying down. Thou art acquainted with all my ways. The idea that God knows us before we even know ourselves. That he knows what our thoughts are going to be. He knows the steps that we're going to take before we even get there. The idea that we can't escape from him. He compassed my path, and from my lying down, you're acquainted with all my ways. There's going to be three critical truths that he shares with us about who God is. His first truth about God is he's omniscient, right? He knows everything about us. He has a knowledge that we can never understand. If we even try to start to understand as a human being, we can't comprehend it. I enjoy reading and learning and understanding things, and studying and opening up my understanding of things around the world, and kind of getting that comprehension. But I can't even begin to comprehend what God can comprehend. To even think that I can study and learn enough that I might even be close to who God is a vain thought, as we would say. So we see this, that God understands everything about us. That God is not just the God up on high that looks down and says, well, let me pick on this person. The idea that he knows everything about me individually. That he's personally related to who I am. He knows everything about me and the mundane things, the sitting down and my uprising, right? It's not just the grand times when I get to stand and speak and teach Sunday school. He's not just watching now. He's watching when I'm sitting, when I'm slow to get out of bed, when I need to get out of bed in the morning, or he says, my down sitting and my uprisings. He understands my thoughts afar off. So we also see in verse 7, he says in verse 6, we see the realization that he gets as he ponders this. He says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain unto it. The idea that God is greater than he can even imagine. Look at verse 7. Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? We see that God is omnipresent, that he is everywhere. We looked at if we go as high as the heavens, or we go down into the depths of the sea, that he's there. There's nowhere that we can hide from him, right? His presence is always with us. With his presence comes his power. We actually turn to Ephesians chapter 3, if you want to real quick. This is when I think of his presence and his power, and his knowledge of us. Ephesians chapter 3, right at the very end of Ephesians 3. Oops. And this is part of Paul's prayer to the people when he thinks about he's praying that they would get to know God better. In Ephesians 3 and verse 13, wherefore I desire that ye faint not at my tribulations, which is for your glory. This cause I bow my knees unto the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, whom all the heaven and earth is named, that he would grant you according to the riches and glory to be strengthened with the might by his Spirit in the inner man, that Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that ye be rooted and grounded in love, and may be able to comprehend with all saints what is the height and breadth and length and depth, breadth and length and depth and height, to know that the love of Christ, which passeth knowledge, that ye might be filled with all the fullness of God. And now unto him that is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that ye ask or think, according to the power that worketh in us, unto him be glory in the church by Jesus Christ through all ages, world without end. Amen. We see there, he says there, the idea that he was praying for the people at that time, that they would be filled with all the fullness of God. Now think back into what we're reading in chapter 139. What's all the fullness of God? Where's God not full in this earth? He's everywhere, right? He's so full. He's everywhere. We can't go anywhere without him. That we can be filled with all the fullness. And he says there in verse 20, now, this is one of my favorite verses, now to him that is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that worketh in us. What do we learn in the beginning of Psalms 139? What does God already know? He knows everything, right? He knows what we think, right? What we're going to ask and what we think. He says there, now to him that is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think. This is the idea that when we know who God is and we understand that our God is a great God. He's not just, like I say, he's not just a God. He is the great God. Then he's able to do more than we can even imagine. Exceedingly abundantly, he's able to continue on. It's an unending supply above all that we could even ask or think. That's who this God is that David's describing. We see his omniscience. We're not hid by death. We see that in verse 7 and 8. We're not hid by darkness. We see that in verse 9 and 10. And then we saw, or by distance, and then we saw in darkness by verse 11 and 12. This idea that there's nowhere we can go, we can't find any cover that's going to keep us away from God. That God is always there. He knows where we're at. We can't dodge God. We can be really crafty and think we're really crafty, and we can be crafty around other people, but we can't dodge God. God is going to always find us. God knows the moves that we're going to make. We see that in verse. We just saw that through verse 7 through 12. We see that also this is where we left off, and we'll pick up here. We see his omnipotence. Verse 13, for thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. Yea, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee, when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect, and in thy book all thy members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them. So we see here that this is talking about God's creation of us, that his power, that he's able to create life. Do you know man can't create life? We can do a lot of things with life. We can go and I remember this is back in high school, that they were able to grow an ear on a rat. I don't know why you want to grow an ear on a rat, but the idea that you could grow a human ear on a rat. But that was so that they were looking at ways that they could be able to transplant, human tissue, be able to grow things without having humans be able to, because we can't grow something. If you lose your ear, we can't just grow an ear back for you. But you know what? We can't make life. Yeah, we can use life to make life, but we can't make life as human beings. God has that power, and that's what he's talking about here, that he has the power to create life. We looked at last time, verse 14, I praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee, when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. The idea where he says curiously wrought, that word curiously talks about the idea of being knit together. We talked last time, when someone does needlework, how do they pay attention to their needlework? Up close, right? You don't just do it without looking. You really pay attention to the needlework that you're doing because you want to get it right. And that's the attention that God gives us when he created us. And when we think about, I'm not important, I'm just another person. I'm one of 7 billion people. But God paid attention to each and every one when he made them. He had a purpose for each and every one of them. He says, my substance was not hid from thee, when I was made in secret. He says in verse 16, again, thine eyes did see my substance, yet being imperfect. In thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, yet when as yet there was none of them. The idea that God saw my substance before he saw my sin. God saw who I was, so that he sent his son to die because he saw my substance before I even existed. He says, yet being unperfect. I'm going to tell you a quick story. I was going to show the video, but I think there's, I want you to watch it. If you want to watch the video later, there's a gentleman by the name of Ron Archer. He's a believer, a Baptist, who shared his testimony at the Gideon Bible conference. But if you want to look him up later, just look up Ron Archer testimony, and it's a 7-minute video. He uses some tougher language than I wanted to share this morning, but it's his honest story of where he came from. Or not language, but as far as just description of what happened to him. But I'm going to give you a little bit of his story, because I think it's when I think of this idea of knowing our substance before we were perfect. So let me tell you about Ron Archer. His parents were immigrants. They were Cuban, and his father was Cuban and his mother was German. They grew up in the Cleveland area. They had 7 kids together, and this is back in the 40s. Now in the 40s, there wasn't the interracial relationship was something that they didn't want everybody to know about, because people took it different ways. And one of their anniversaries, his grandfather had a little too much to drink, and a guy came up to him and made a snide comment about their relationship, about her loving a black man, and he punched him, put him in prison. The grandfather ended up in prison, maximum security prison, because he had punched this guy because he had said something about his wife. So his grandmother with 7 kids had to take on odd jobs. She lost her job when the paper found out about her felony husband. She lost her job. She had to take on odd jobs, cleaning houses, cleaning toilets, taking care of other people's kids, with her own 7 kids to take care of. She ended up not feeling well one day. Went to the doctor. The doctor said, "You have cancer. You have a tumor behind your left eye. We're going to have to do surgery. You're going to be disfigured for the rest of your life. You're going to lose a good portion of your face there." In the hospital, now this is not in his one testimony, I was listening to one of his other testimonies. In the hospital, there was a Catholic priest that came to her, tried to comfort her, and said, "You got these 7 kids and they're biracial. It's better you just you go and give them up for adoption and just go on with your life as a white woman." Because it's going to be too hard for you to try and take care of these 7 kids. She refused. She said, "I don't see the color. I see my beautiful children." But that was her interaction with faith at the time. She ended up homeless, living on the streets. They lost everything over time because of their medical bills. Her sons ended up in a gang, selling drugs, addicted to heroin. Ron Archer's mother, at age 14, got pulled into prostitution. At 17, she got pregnant. The prostitute, the pimp for his mother, didn't want the baby because that wasn't good for business. They called it a trick baby because that's what in the profession that she was in, that's what they called the profession. And they called him a trick baby, and they tried to abort the baby. Without any medical help. They did it. I mean, it was crude, and tried to abort him. The baby was born alive. Had no pancreas. Had a bladder issue. Had a stutter. Learning disability. That was Ron Archer. His mother was living with a woman that hated men. She abused him viciously. Took out her rage, her anger about men on him. He learned at an early age what it meant to be worthless, what it meant to feel like nobody loved you. He said at the age of 10, he took his mother's gun to his forehead, pulled the trigger, and it didn't go. At 10 years old, when a kid should be focused on dreams and hopes, he was ready to give up. Ron Archer went to school, continued on into school, was in the disabled program or class, whatever, and they put him in a boiler room. Kind of forgot about him, this class. Nobody really cared about him. This is in the 60s. They just put him in this boiler room, didn't really care about him. But there was a teacher he had. This teacher had a Gideon Bible that she brought to church, or brought to school, and worked with these kids. And she started teaching them out of this Gideon Bible, of the characters in the Bible who weren't perfect, had challenges, had suffered, and had these terrible lives. This teacher taught Ron Harcher that someone cared about him, that God cared about him, that God had a purpose for his life. Ron accepted Christ through this teacher. Ron ended up going to become the valedictorian of his high school. He ended up going on to become a VP of a corporate company. Ron, because of that Gideon Bible, saw his entire family saved. This family that was atheistic, that had given up on God a long time ago, had a baby that had no chance. It was known as a trick baby. They didn't realize that the trick was on the devil, that God was going to use that baby to do something great. This idea that God knows our substance before we were even born, that he knew who we were going to be, how he could use us. We've got to realize that as believers, because sometimes we get comfortable and we think, God, I'm where I'm supposed to be. But God knows that the impact that he's going to have in our lives. And Ron didn't get settled with, I don't have a purpose. I don't have a life. Ron knew better. Ron knew that God had a purpose for him. He saw that and used that. It's a great testimony. I encourage you if you want. I mean, he's a large Cuban guy. But if you want to listen to hear him tell that story of this baby that nobody cared about, that God used to see his entire family saved because of the faith of one teacher teaching him, caring about him, showing him that God had known his substance before he was born. So we think of this idea that God knows us, that he created us, his power that he has, that he uses in us. Look at verse 17. We see David's reaction to this. He says that David understands that God considers me. How precious are thy thoughts unto me, O God. How great is the sum of them. If I should count them, they are more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with thee. David saw that God was constant. That God was going to be a constant influence in his life. We see that he says, when I awake, I am still with thee. That God, even when David may go as far away as possible but when he wakes up, God is still there. The idea that God is committed to him. How precious are thy thoughts unto me, O God. How great are the sum of them. If I count them, they are more in number than the sand. We think about our kids when our kids are growing up, and your kids aren't with you, and they're out playing down the street. Your thoughts are with them sometime. You're like, wonder what they're doing. Wonder if they're okay. God's thoughts are constant for us. As a parent to a child, he's constantly thinking about us, constantly considering us. And he's doing more than just considering. He's constantly working for us and caring for us and comforting us. He says, if I should count them, they are more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with thee. The idea that David couldn't even fathom the thoughts that God had for him. Now think about what are some of the things that happened in David's life for him to know that God was thinking about him? What do y'all think? What are some ways, think back in David's life. David's had a pretty rich life to be able to say, God is thinking about me. Yeah. How many times did David cheat death in life? Quite a few times, right? Where God had put him in some very dangerous situations and taken care of him. What else? How does he know that God was thinking about him? Goliath. Yeah. Go and stand up before a 9-foot tall guy and say, stop blaspheming my God. And we'll see that in a minute. We'll see that faith that David has in a minute. God had thoughts towards him, right? What else? Well, think of David's life. Where else do we see God thinking towards David? Yeah.
Even keep the sheep out in the night. Have a lot of time to meditate.
Yeah. So at an early age, he probably realized a lot of that God was thinking about him. Yeah. Because his faith to get to Goliath didn't start when he walked onto the battlefield, right? Now, he may have checked his faith when he walked on the battlefield, but his faith started a long time before that. What else? He escaped death from Saul, yep. On the run. We looked at last time when David was in the cave and he felt alone. He had his mighty men around him sitting in the cave, and we looked at the other Psalms, I think it was 141, where he says, I looked around to my right and my left and no one knew me. But who knew him? Who did he look to? God. He says, even in my quietest time, when no one understands my heart or the trials that I go through, God knows me. God knows my thoughts. What else? What else do we see? What about with his kids? He didn't have an easy time with his kids either. Absalom, the challenges there. I mean, we saw that God's thoughts were towards him. The kingdom, establishing his kingdom. That God would come and give a covenant with him, that he would establish his lineage, that God was with him. He knew God's thoughts were with him constantly. To go from being a shepherd boy to being a king of a nation, of God's nation. I mean, there's some power behind that. And he knew that God's thoughts were with him, that God knew every step that he took to get him there. God knew the failures that he did. God knew the successes and the victories, not just defeating the lions, but God knew the times that David was ready to give up. God knew all of those times. Let's look at verse 19. We see, so David's had this revelation of understanding God's omniscience, his omnipresence, his omnipotence. And now we see one of David's requests. And there's two requests in here. The first one we see is a request of salvation from the wicked around him. Surely thou wilt slay the wicked, O Lord, O God. Depart from me, therefore, ye bloody men, for they speak against thee wickedly, and thine enemies take thy name in vain. Do not I hate them, O Lord, that hate thee? Am I not grieved by those that rise up against thee? I hate them with a perfect hatred. I count them my enemies. David saw the wicked around him. David knew that that God had established him despite the strife that he faced. The world was not a peaceful place around him. His kingdom, he had established his kingdom and there was peace within his kingdom, but it was not a peaceful place. There were constantly threats from other kingdoms. And David said, surely thou wilt slay the wicked, O Lord. Depart from me, therefore, ye bloody men, for they speak they speak against thee wickedly, and thine enemies take thy name in vain. We saw David's perspective about taking the Lord's name in vain. Who was the first one that David took issue with, that took his name in vain? Goliath, right? That David understood that it wasn't just about those that rose up against him with the sword, but those that rose up against God with their voice. Think about that. How seriously do we take God's name? Why is God's name important? We looked at that actually in chapter 38. We say, go back in chapter 38. Look at verse 2. I will worship towards thy holy temple and praise thy name for thy loving kindness, for thy truth, for thou hast magnified thy word above all thy name. Here David took exception when someone took the Lord's name in vain. Yeah, and he says here what? Magnify thy word above all thy name. So that the foundation is God's word, or God's name, right? And so someone takes God's name in vain, what are they doing? What are they calling God, in other words? What are they calling God? If I take your name in vain, what am I doing to your name? I'm slandering you, right? I'm blaspheming you. I'm basically saying your name is nothing. There was at work, we've had times where people will give us a hard time, and we joke that their name becomes a curse word because you don't want to hear their name anymore because they give you a hard time. That's what it's a slander piece, that their name has become slander. When you hear that name is just it's disgusting to you, and that's how they spoke God's name. And David said, I don't want to hear anyone speak God's name with disgust. I don't want to hear them speak it flippantly, because what? God's name is powerful, and not only is God's name powerful, but it represents His word. When I say that God it's just God, right? What am I saying about His promises? What am I saying about His promises when I just kind of brush off God's name?
Promises were vain.
They're vain, right? We're saying that what God has promised, what God has given us, who God is just no big deal. And we know that's dangerous, right? That's blasphemous. That's what the devil did. That's what Lucifer did when he was thrown out of heaven. He said, "You know what, God, you're not as great as you think you are. I'm just as good as you." And then when we take God's name in vain, that's what we're doing. And David knew that the foundation of rebellion came with taking God's name in vain. When we start taking God's name in vain, it's easy to rebel against God. When I start just saying, "God, yeah, whatever, God. What's going to happen to the rest of my life?" It's easier for me to say, "Yeah, whatever, God," in the other areas of my life, right? When I start to take His name in vain. And these were, he says, and a couple of the commentators talk about David separating himself from people who were like this, people who had been built up with pride, and David taking steps to separate himself. One of the writers talks about Joab, and as Joab killed Abner, David separated himself. He says, "That man's dangerous." He says, "I don't want to be associated with him." The idea that David was asking David expressed alignment, I guess is the best way to say it. David aligned himself with God. He said, "God, there's going to be some that take their name in vain, and there's going to be some that glorify you. I want to be the one that glorifies you. I don't want to be like them, Lord." I said, rule judgment upon them is what he's asking. He says, "Do I not hate them, O Lord, that hate thee? Am I not grieved with those that rise up against thee? I hate them with a perfect hatred. I count them my enemies." David understood what was right and what was wrong. And David understood when folks spoke against God, how that should be addressed. David says, "I hate them with a perfect hatred. I count them my enemies." That's harder to do today, right? In our world. It's easy when you got the Philistines and the Israelites, right? The Philistines have a god that they've got Baal or whoever else they're worshiping at the time. And the Israel's worshiping God. Today it's harder to do that, right? We have a lot of Christians who take God's name in vain. We have Christians, people who will stand up and say, "Thank God for this award. Thank God for this blessing that He's given me," and turn around and live a life that sets themselves as enemies against God. It's harder for us to do that. But God says, but David says what? "Lord, I know who you are, and I know I'm going to follow you no matter what." And that led David to this second request. We see in verse 23, he says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me. Lead me in the way everlasting." We often read this verse, and I'm sure many of us can quote it at the end of this chapter. And it's easy to jump to this verse. "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." The idea of searching me. It's easy to jump there and say, "God, this is a good invitation verse." God, at the time of invitation, "God, come and search me, know me, help me understand my thoughts, try my thoughts." But think about what we just read in those first 22 verses of this psalm. Who is God? Does God need to search us?
He's the God of all knowing and understanding.
God of all knowing and understanding. He's the God that He doesn't need to search us, does He? So is David asking this question for God's sake or for our sake? For our sake, right? He says there, you see, David's mind was going from a revelation of who God was to a reverence of who God was. He says, "Search me, O God, and try and know my heart." This is a statement of reverence. He knows. He says, "God, now that I've been pondering more about you and I know who you are, and I pinned it into words of who you are, God." He's like, "Search me, O God, and know my heart." The idea that he wants his heart to be aligned with God. This is more than just having God know who his heart is. This is actually aligning his heart with God. It's a revelation to a reverence. And then we also, realization to a reverence, and then a reverence to a revelation. He says, and try me and know my thoughts. He says this idea that when we have a revelation of who God is, it should change our perspective of ourselves, right? What's he say there? Try me and know my thoughts. Did God already know his thoughts? Absolutely. Did David know his thoughts? Probably not as much as he realized God did. How many times have you had thoughts and you're like, man, why did I just think that? That's what he's saying. He says, God, try me and know my thoughts. Be a mirror to me and show those thoughts back to me and show me those areas that that I need to pay attention to. I think about when we're out somewhere, Rachel and I I'm like, man, I don't have hair to worry about, but we'll ask each other, hey, something doesn't look, do I have mud on my face or do I have dirt on me or something? Like, we'll ask someone to know me. I mean, she knows who I am, but it's the idea of asking her to look at me and know me. Is there anything different about me that I don't realize? He says, try me and know my thoughts. Show something to me that I don't know. Help me to understand it. We see that revelation led to a redirection in verse 24. And see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. He says he didn't want to just know the good stuff. He didn't say, God, go and examine me and know the good. Show me the good stuff. Show me how spiritual I am, God. Show me how all the great stuff I'm doing for you. Don't pat me on the back like a child wants, right? Your kids crave attention. They crave that justification and the encouragement from their parents. And that's not what David's asking here. David's realized more than that. David's realized I'm not just going to get compliments from God. Like, that's not what he's asking for. What's he say there? See if there be any wicked way in me. That takes maturity. I don't think I've had my kids yet come to me and say, Dad, tell me what I'm doing wrong. That takes maturity, right? Because what's going to happen? They're going to find out something they probably don't want to know. And when we think about our maturity in our Christian walk, for us to be able to say, God, show me any wicked way. He doesn't say just show me what's the worst ways I'm doing, God. Just show me the worst, because I can fix the worst. But show me any wicked way. Any sign of wickedness, Lord, show it to me. We talked about God knows our thoughts afar off, right? Before we even realize that we're what our thoughts are. He says, show me any wicked way. Not wicked actions. He says wicked way. What way doesn't align with your thoughts, Lord? What way doesn't align with the way that you want me to walk, that you prescribed? And think of this in the context of what we just read in verse 19 through 22. Who did he talk about? Surely thou shalt slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, ye bloody men, for they speak against thee wickedly, and thine enemies take thy name in vain. This is who David's comparing to when he says thy wicked way, right? Who does he not want to become like? The wicked. He says, don't let me become like them. David understood his frailty, the potential for him to go down that same path. And so we as believers have to understand that we can go down that same path. It doesn't take much. If we're not letting God search us and try us and know our thoughts, we can take one step towards the wicked and then another step towards the wicked. And before we realize that we are down that wicked way, he says there, he wants him to change his direction. He's in that second part of that verse, and lead me in the way everlasting. That way that was everlasting. What was the way of the wicked? Where did it lead? To destruction, right? The way of the wicked led to destruction. What did the way of God lead to? What's he say there? The way everlasting. It was a sustainable way. It was a way that had blessings and care. That was a way that could be walked and continued on forever. So we think about Psalms 139. We see that those last two verses. Every time when I read these last two verses, now I'm going to think about what David reflected on at the beginning, the first 22 verses. Because it's not just searching me, God, as in, catch me doing something wrong, right? This is asking God to help me align myself and my spirit with who God is. And then if I'm not aligning myself, I'm going to go the wicked way. And he says he wants him to lead him in the way everlasting. So we see that realization of who God is led to a reverence, which led to a revelation, which led to a redirection in David's life. So we're going to finish early today, and I know that's a first for me. So any questions or thoughts on Psalms 139?
Back in verse 20 there, you put reference to the taking his name in vain. And this is an issue with Christians. We found it okay to use euphemisms.
Mm-hmm.
And where we're really just saying Jesus, or by shortening it, or using God's name in vain by using other
Mm-hmm.
But they are taking his name in vain.
Yeah, and actually when we think about, and so the idea of taking his name in vain through euphemisms, it's really about the heart change. And it's really about, as Christians and believers, what's leading us to use those terms. Like, why would we use those terms to begin with? Is because we're probably reacting out of the wrong heart. We're reacting out of a way, in a manner that's not the way that God wants us to react. Because those are usually expletives, is what we're using, as a replacement for expletives. But God wants us to have an attitude towards life that's different than those around us. So we shouldn't have to use expletives and as euphemisms or God's name. We should be able to have that attitude of God. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, and a lot of times it is ignorance, and a lot of times it's an interesting study. We did it several Sunday school or a couple of years ago in one of our Sunday school classes about language itself and how language changes and what's acceptable in certain cultures and language. But God's name is one that has never been acceptable. It's like we may use there may be bathroom terms that are used in Old English that we don't use today, that we don't see as acceptable in our culture or our language, because it was they didn't have bathrooms like we did, so it was a very crass, kind of in your face, upfront issue. But God's language, or using God's name, was always revered. And so a lot of times it is ignorance. A lot of times it's us kind of helping people understand God's name is valuable. And a lot of times people use that name because they don't see the value in who God is. And so I've known some folks that use it because they feel like they're crying out to God. And that's how they've kind of framed it. And it's like, no, that's not how you cry out to God. Other thoughts? Psalms 139. On God knowing us. Questions? Yeah.
Like he said about that video of Ron Archer, I've seen it. It's very, very powerful, very interesting, and I suggested that maybe if you want to see it on your own, because some things the way he explains, but it's worth seeing. It'll really get to you to think about the reality of life and what happens to people, and what happens to this man, and what he became. Because somebody cared about it. Very impressive. And also about the using the Lord's name in vain. I'm on Facebook, of course, and I see things. But what amazes me is some Christians that use OMG repeatedly. And it's just disturbing to see that. Shorten it up however you want to say it, but still not doing the right thing to the Lord's name.
Yeah, the idea that, I didn't touch on it, didn't need to, preach on that today, but the idea that God knows us on social media too. That he doesn't hide when we type things. Just because we didn't say it doesn't mean God doesn't see it. I don't know. I don't think God needs a Facebook account to be able to see what we say, but he knows what we type, what we think, what we say. And so our presence there is just as much as important as if we're standing in front of somebody. Hopefully that's not an issue in here. Hopefully not. Anybody else? Thoughts? Psalms 139? It's a powerful chapter, and I know we took 2 Sundays to get there, but to really conceive of who God is. And it should be, as David says, "Oh, precious are the thought," or is it, "Oh, precious is his, how precious also are thy thoughts unto me, O God, how great is the sum of them." That should be our reaction when we read Psalms 139. We should be thinking about, the preciousness that God has in our lives, that he's cared for us. And I think someone has said before, you won't look into someone's eyes today that God hasn't loved. the person you despise, maybe you say, I don't despise, but the person you would look down upon or look angry at or anything else, that's someone that God has had thoughts from the beginning of time, that he has thought about their substance before when they were imperfect. It's easy for us to get kind of prideful and say, well, God thought about my substance, but he thought about every other soul before we could even imagine that. And so when we start to realize that, we start to see souls a little bit differently. All right, anything else? Let's close.